Hey folks, I'm Allison Morrissey. I was at the first session and not at the second too, and I'm glad to be back. So this workshop is going to be focusing on reviewing the concept of resiliency as it applies to infants and toddlers, identifying key strategies and types of caregiver interaction that build resiliency in children birth to age 3, exploring barriers and strategies for working with hard-to-reach parents and caregivers, exploring barriers and strategies for working with the child welfare system, DCF, and recognizing the symptoms of vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue and learning self-care practices. I want to have a special focus today on you guys thinking about your teaching staffs, whether or not you're in a support position or an administrative or supervisory position. When we're talking about this stuff, I want you to be thinking about how your teaching staff is supported. Okay. A couple things. One is that there was some feedback that there were a lot of side talk the last session, and some people requested that be limited, that it was hard to hear. Am I forgetting anything?
And although I appreciate everybody turning off phones, I have to leave on my phone because my babies are with a new person, and a teenager, so I just want to make sure I'm available just in case. So I apologize if my phone rings.
Okay.
Okay. So one of the first things that we're going to start with is the list that you guys did way, way, way back 3 weeks ago. In your handouts, there should be the charts that will look familiar. It's got the developmental stuff, things that get in the way of development, red flags, and then tips for caregivers. Of course, I didn't save myself a copy of it, but I see it right in front of Courtney. And on top, yep, there it is. Yep, exactly.
It's also written in a different format because we both ended up working on this separately. So you have two different versions in there.
Thank you. So these, I just took a couple minutes, and Allison also did because it's in different formats, to put what you guys had come up with in your groups. If you see something in italics, that's just something that the group didn't have time to get to, and so I'm just on the first page with the little chart like this. The ones in italics are just things that I added because the groups didn't have time to get to it. And then handy on the flip side of the page are general tips for caregivers. So these are tips specific to the caregiver. So the tips on the front page with the chart are about the children, what the caregivers can do to help the children. And then the back side is about general tips for caregivers. And what I just wanted to take a few minutes to think about is, I know we've talked about trauma a fair amount over the last couple of weeks, and in doing these, we're not going to go through them all because there are a lot of them, but if everybody just wants to take a second and peruse the list and see if there's anything that you would think about adding if you're looking at it through sort of a trauma-informed lens and just what you've learned over the last couple of weeks. And there might not be anything. I mean, these lists were pretty complete. I was pretty impressed.
I was just curious too, in thinking about it, how these very essential caregiving tasks that we perform every day, how now that we've been thinking about attachment and trauma and healing broken attachments, how these typical caregiving tasks take on a new meaning. They really take on a value for these specific children that is beyond words. So, and you guys do it every day.
And while you're also going through the list, just thinking about how easy or difficult it would be for your teachers to be implementing these in the classroom. I mean, because one of the most difficult things is applying sort of discussion to practice. And so, the reality in a classroom is there are a lot of kids, they outnumber the teachers, and if you have a number of kids that are having issues related to trauma, these things are really good in theory, but it takes practice to be able to stop and apply whatever the tip is for this caregiver. But it's really essential not only for the child, but also for the teachers in the classroom. It may seem like it's more work in the beginning because it's sort of retraining your brain a little bit in some ways, but ultimately it makes the classroom a more stable setting because the children are feeling more safe and secure, which ultimately makes the teacher's job a little bit easier, although teachers' jobs are very difficult anyways. So,
does anyone have any thoughts or comments about that?
Question?
Sure.
Under newborn infants on the chart,
yep.
third one down, it says schedule and comforting interview HX. I don't know what
Oh,
HX is.
history. History. Or at least that's what I'm assuming the
It,
group
it's
meant.
history, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. I sometimes forget shorthand doesn't always get translated out. Okay. So we're going to take a few minutes and do an activity. So if you want to break yourselves into 2 groups, so 3 and 3 and 4 and 4. So this is your child, and you're going to get that one over there. And this is your guys' kid.
This is your child. This is your child.
So if you want to just take a couple of minutes and just read the vignette about your specific child. Okay. So I'd like you to break into your small groups just for a second and talk about 3 questions. What thoughts do you have about your particular child? Sort of what are the things that are popping out at you in the vignette? Are there any red flags? And what approach would you take to helping this child on a daily basis? And this is something that is applicable really for your teachers, since I know some of you are in the classroom, some of you are not. But it's also just good to think about everything that we've talked about over the last 3 weeks, sort of applying that to these kids. So maybe take 7 minutes.
If someone could be a scribe and take notes about what you guys are discussing, that would be helpful.
So we're going to go around the different groups, and just if somebody could read the vignette out loud, and then another person in the group could talk about the questions, that would be excellent. So who had baby Skylar? You guys want to?
I'll read the vignette. Skylar, who is 18 months, arrives on her first day of preschool. The caregiver drops her off and promptly leaves. Skylar comes in and doesn't look back at the caregiver and does not seem distressed that she left. Skylar promptly grabs a baby doll from another child. While running away from that child, she trips and falls, hitting her head on the floor. She gets up, laughs, and continues on her way. When asked, she gives back the doll, says sorry, and hugs the child. The caregiver never has time to talk because she has to get to work. Skylar's 18 months.
So do you guys want to, does somebody want to read what you wrote down about thoughts you were having about this child, any red flags, and what would you do to support the child on a daily basis?
Well, some of the red flags were the lack of distress when the caregiver left, her response to falling down and hitting her head, and also the child's response to asking to take the doll back that she grabbed from another child. Just, I'm sorry, and then left. Were the big ones for us.
Can you talk a little bit, if you feel comfortable, about why they were red flags for you?
Well, we had some back and forth with the lack of distress. It could be, this is the first day, she just happened to be there, and maybe on the 3rd or 4th day, she realizes, uh-oh, she's not coming back, and then it's a different sort of an entry.
Right.
Another question we had was, who is the caregiver that she's not turning around to be distressed about? Is it a parent, a grandparent, a foster parent, a DCF worker? We also thought that the child care person should find a time that she can talk with the caregiver to get a history on the child. If they can't do it in the morning or the afternoon, perhaps on the phone. Just to get a background on why. There's a lot of questions in this.
Yeah.
I know. I know.
You can say her mommy or her.
Right. And I intentionally left it vague because it's exactly like you had said, you're not jumping to any conclusions. Each child is different. They respond to stress differently. The child could just be super psyched to be at preschool because all of her 5 other siblings have gone off to school and she's finally there. But it's right, you know, a flag goes off and you don't necessarily need to act on it, but something seems like you need to watch it a little bit more, which is exactly what you were talking about. So, who had baby David?
David is 21 months old and has been in the preschool for 6 months. Overall, he's a good sharer, and many of the other kids like him in the class. He knows some of his colors and the letter D. He is easily upset and frequently cries and tantrums. When asked to change activities, circle, time to outside, etc., he resists and sometimes will hit other kids. Nap time, though, is the worst. He cries, screams, and throws his clothes, shoes included, off of his cot. The caregivers report that everything is fine at home.
So for your group, what did you guys, your thoughts about David, any possible red flags, and how would you encourage the teachers to support him during the day?
Red flags would be the frequently cries, tantrums, resisting transitional periods, hitting other kids, and nap time.
Mm-hmm.
So we are guessing that he has a lack of self-soothing mechanism at rest time, and we would want to know more about what his routine is for sleep time at home, wherever that is. So we would want to get clear information from a caregiver, ask about bedtime and bedtime routines and regular routines, as well as make sure that we're giving advance warning of upcoming transitions and doing things at nap time, like taking his shoes long before he can throw them out. We think that limits are an issue, transitions are difficult, so we would want to have a designated staff member who makes a bond with this child and have that person available, especially at nap time, to give the child more support through these transitions and help to point out others' reactions when he does things like hit, so he can help start to develop some empathy and that type of thing.
Exactly. That's a very complete list, and that's a great list. And it's things like that, you know, that teachers probably in general already know most of that, but it's sort of bringing a consciousness to it and looking at it from each individual child. So, you know, David could just have issues around sleep for whatever reason, but it could also be trauma, that he experienced neglect for the first, you know, half of his life, and he spent his entire time in a crib by himself. So it's really important to talk with the caregiver and to get that information and then apply that whole picture to how you would work with David on a daily basis.
Because, you know, most kids with a sleep history don't have a trauma history, a sleep issue, don't have a trauma history, but all kids with a trauma history have sleep issues. So it's a little red flag waving there. And there's a continuum of behaviors listed there that almost every 21-month-old has.
Yep.
But there's something quirky about him, something that pops out that gives you that feeling.
Who had Kiara?
Kiara is a 6-month-old infant who has been in two foster homes since being removed from her birth parents at birth. She just started child care 1 month ago. Kiara is not able to sit up on her own, can only roll in one direction, show little interest in playing with toys or engaging with anyone. She lays quietly watching everyone going around her. She is really easygoing and rarely cries. She's a good eater and drinks multiple bottles a day. The foster parent doesn't know much about her, so can't provide insight.
Okay. And your red flags and how you would help support this child?
Well, the not rolling over is a red flag. Flat out, that is a red flag. Not crying. Doesn't say anything about eye contact with the caregiver, but you can probably assume that she doesn't have any, that she's not really showing any interest. We don't really know about sounds, but probably so the thoughts were that she would need a referral to early intervention. From attachment issues, releasing delayed attachments. intentional connection time with a particular caregiver to support for tongue time, perhaps physical therapy and or occupational therapy depending on what we're mentioning. Hearing check to rule out that consistency with caregivers. The other one that I just thought of was that she probably needs a weight check because she is a good eater, drinking multiple bottles a day, so to make sure that she's not getting, that she's not overweight.
And it's very interesting with your group because there's a lot of medical stuff that's being checked there, which is, of course, something that I haven't talked a whole lot about, but it is always important to sort of rule out any medical issues that are going on with the child before sort of going to that place of, well, this is definitely something in the core of the child that needs to be repaired. And with a child like Kiara, you know, it's really difficult for a 6-month-old who's been in 3 different homes and trying to find a primary caregiver to support her, because as we've discovered over the last couple of weeks, kids can't do this on their own. They can't develop their social emotional foundation by themselves, and that's one of the great things about being in a consistent childcare setting is that if you use the primary teacher model, then the child can learn to attach to that teacher. Baby Maddox.
Maddox is 9 months old and has been in childcare since he was 5 months old. He's startled when the other kids make too much noise, or a teacher's voice is too loud and is difficult to soothe. He has difficulty sleeping and will wake frequently crying during naps. He's very small for his age. He loves his new teacher and frequently wants to sit in her lap. When upset, he will seek her out for comfort. His mother is unresponsive to requests to meet with the teacher and often seems sad and low energy when picking up and dropping off Maddox.
So what were your guys' red flags, and how would you support or encourage the teachers to support him?
So the red flags for us were obviously the startling from a lot of the noise and being difficult to soothe. And with that, we thought, you know, it could be related to, you know, an auditory sensory thing that's going on, or it could be hypervigilance. You know, it could be more an organic sensory processing, or it could be more something that's based on a trauma. And obviously at this point the teacher's not aware because he doesn't have a lot of contact with mom, but also the difficulty with sleeping was something that brought up a red flag, and the fact that he's very small for his age. You know, the last possible minute, you said to me, it could be failure to thrive.
Yeah, it could be.
So I mean, there's any number of things, but definitely one thing we did want to say is that it's a strength that, you know, he does have an attachment to a primary caregiver. So something is happening there, something is positive there, and so some of the things we thought to do would be to have a lot of contact with mom, even if it's just a couple of minutes during pickup time, to try to make some eye contact and see if we can start to bridge that gap, because I think mom probably needs some assistance.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a main part. And then a really strong nap time routine would be another thing.
And then the other thing we talked about was reducing auditory stimulation when it's possible in the classroom, since he startles.
Right. Exactly. Those are
And
all
classrooms are difficult places to reduce auditory stimulation. It is possible.
And with older children, you know, some children will know that there are headphones they can go and put on when they're feeling, you know, assaulted by the
Exactly.
It's a little young for that, but the teachers could be aware of it.
Right, exactly. And kids pick up on, you know, this is a high energy child, this is not a high energy child, and can regulate, you know, some of the kids that have better regulation skills can regulate themselves around the other kids. And it's never going to be perfect, but it's sort of what you can do to help on a day-to-day basis. And I did like what you guys had also said about really making an effort to engage with the mom, because oftentimes the kids that we're working with either don't have a consistent caregiver or have a caregiver that is dealing with so many issues on their own that they're not really able to be present for the child anyways. And making that effort, I also know that a lot of the kids get bused, so you don't actually see the parents. But if a parent is dropping off or picking up a child, even just a couple of minutes of engagement with that parent and modeling of your interaction with the child can help. You never know what's going to work and what's not going to work.
And just also highlighting any strengths that you observe,
yes,
actual strengths, not
exactly.
But if you see something positive that the mom is doing,
exactly,
highlight it.
Yep.
So that the person is doing it.
Yeah.
And we also thought of one other thing, maybe a health check.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think that is important to find out. Sort of I know it's not in the teacher's job descriptions necessarily, but there is an investigator role around what is going on with this child, what is their history, what services do they have in place, and what do we need to do to get this child to a more stable place. Because 0 to 3 is a really critical time, and they spend a lot of time, for the most part, in childcare settings, and teachers have a huge impact on how kids can develop. So these are, this is a list that you guys have actually already seen. It's from one of the previous trainings. I'm not going to go through them, but it's just, again, more suggestions for caregivers to use in the classrooms with the kids. And I know there are bazillions of suggestions throughout all the handouts and this stuff. But, you know, again, you can never, just as you can never tell what's going to work with a parent, you can never tell what's going to work for a particular teacher and their style. And so you give them a whole list, and then they can pick a couple that kind of resonate with them and that they can actually feel like they can apply in the classroom and to the children.
So if you guys want to open up your packet and find this handout, securely attached versus insecurely attached children. I know you've got a lot of stuff going on there. It's at the second page of this one.
Oh.
So, second page of this one. Yep. This is a handout that's really intended for preschool age children, but I think it's appropriate to be thinking about your older 0 to 3-year-olds and when you look at this list. And I think it's really helpful to be thinking through this lens when you're thinking about kids who have trauma histories or broken attachments. It's sort of like a light bulb going off, where, the example of timeout, I know you guys don't do timeout, but you do probably have them take some time away. Where timeout is effective for a securely attached child, an insecurely attached child will escalate. So it's not even just about what the child needs at this point. It's also how your teachers can, de-escalate their classroom situations if they know this stuff. With a securely attached child, it's our nature to encourage independence. With an insecurely attached child, the first thing that they need is to feel comfortable being dependent. So I just think this is a really helpful handout. I think it's a very helpful handout for your teachers. One of the things that I think is important to point out on here is that securely attached children have a sense of safety and appropriate boundaries, and insecurely attached children are not aware of physical danger. They're our risk-taker children. They're the ones that say, I can do that. So they really need a lot more supervision, which is more exhausting for your teachers and creates a cycle. Right. So where are we now?
We're building resiliency.
Okay. So we're just going to do a quick review of building resiliency because I know you guys focused on that last week quite a bit. But we just want to make sure to point out that resiliency is, affects everything. The effects of trauma on children can be mitigated by the presence of a supportive caregiver, even if the caregiver is unable to alter the outcome of events. And I think that's really important for your teachers to know, that the traumatic event has taken place, the child has been impacted, but if you're helping that child build their resiliency skills, you're helping them to heal, right?
And with the vignettes, when you guys do the trainings with teachers, it's another opportunity to use the vignettes and talk about how would they build resiliency in these specific children. So working with hard-to-reach families. We all have this experience of working with hard-to-reach families. So I'd like you to break back into your groups and discuss 2 questions. What kind of behaviors characterize a hard-to-engage family? And what challenging behavior, or what are the behaviors that are most challenging to you? And again, thinking about it, you can, when you do the training for the teachers, it'll be for what's triggering the most to them. But
And Sarah's referring to family behaviors, not individual child behaviors, correct?
Right. Yeah.
So what is it about working with families that poses difficulties and challenges?
What are the most challenging behaviors for you to deal with? So, for example, you know, the example I always think about is there were 2 teachers, and they both had alcoholic parents growing up, and one was, the alcoholic parent was very abusive, physically abusive, and the other one, when the parents started drinking, became really jovial and engaging. It was sort of like the person came alive. So if they had a parent come into the classroom that was actively using, their reactions to that parent were very different. One teacher could handle it and be totally fine and work with it, and the other one was completely triggered and couldn't deal with the alcoholic or high parent, whoever it was. So just sort of to give you an example.
And I think before you get started on this activity, you know, one of the thoughts I always have when I do teacher workshops, so thinking about your teachers, is that they don't take this course anywhere on how to work with families, and it takes up a huge amount of their work, and it is the most challenging piece of their work. So that they really need a lot of support in learning how to communicate, work with, build relationships with hard-to-reach families.
So if you guys could just take 5 minutes in your little groups and talk about what behaviors sort of characterize a hard-to-reach family, and then what behaviors are most challenging to you. Let's start over there with Amy's group. You guys want to just sort of fire off the characteristics of hard-to-reach, sort of what you identify as hard-to-reach families?
We talked about general characteristics of withdrawn or depressed parents or caregivers, resistant, people that appear that they're in denial about what's really going on,
That really triggers our teachers.
angry, aggressive, angry and aggressive,
Yeah, those are always the really fun parents to deal with.
defensive,
Yeah.
active substance abusers, anxious. And by anxious, I was kind of specifically thinking about one particular caregiver who had OCD that really interfered with her participation, and inconsistent. They don't show up, when they say they're going to show up.
You pretty much got that covered.
Yeah. Does anybody have anything that's not on this list? Yeah.
Parents and caregivers that don't return phone calls or emails, or don't even have a voicemail, or changing phone numbers and don't update their information, miss appointments, or don't return to talk, defensive, as you said, always having excuses or blaming. Well, it must be you're not meeting this meeting.
He doesn't do that at home.
Right.
Or everything is fine.
Everything is fine at home. I don't know why you're having a problem with them.
Rationalizing behaviors. Okay when they're sober, but they're different when they're not.
Anything that was missed? Sorry that you guys get to talk at all. I'll start on this side.
I've got one.
Yeah, go ahead.
The parent who has a lack of boundaries.
Ah, yes.
Especially if there's spillover that affects the classroom.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
yes to everything and never follows up. The parent who is accusatory or suspicious, lacks trust, never smiles. And then the all-important eye roll.
The eye roller, yeah.
Not accepting of more support, more, referring to as specialist kind of thing.
Resistant to services, resistant to services.
Pretty much both of them all.
Yep.
I've got one.
Yep.
The parents that are in a domestic violence situation. He's got a restraining order? No, he doesn't have a restraining order.
Yep.
He's got a restraining order? He doesn't.
But I want to amend the restraining order. No, the court didn't say I could amend it, but I'm going to amend it anyways. Yeah. So these are, in a nutshell, what makes it difficult sometimes to work with families, and families that don't necessarily want to work with us, but want the child to continue at the child care. And, part of it is we're going to get to how to work with them, but it is a give and take. You guys, the teachers are not there just to babysit these children. They're there to provide structure and education to these kids and help them to develop. And the parents do need to be a part of that. And these all can make it very difficult, but a lot of these, particularly, defensiveness, resistant, depression, some of this stuff is a result of something else, or particularly with the anger and aggression, it's usually covering something else, but it's an easy way to keep everybody at bay. If I'm really overwhelmed by my life, how am I going to make my rent? How am I going to keep a roof over my kid's head? How am I going to buy formula or milk? Or I guess that's all covered by WIC, but you know what I mean. It's easiest to keep everybody else that's demanding of me at bay by just being really aggressive and in their face, because nobody's going to bother me if I'm like that. And it's really important for the teachers to moderate themselves in order to slowly start building that relationship with the parent and to engage with them. So behaviors you find most challenging in working with these families. Let's start on this side.
Open hostility. And maybe with that is the accusatory parent.
I don't know how to spell accusatory. Yeah. Sorry.
I know, but I don't. The parent that yes is you.
What was that?
Yes, parent.
Yes. Passive aggressive parent.
Parents would take the exit because if you say for the parent, you're asking a question, the exit way is to cry, or the exit way is to
Yeah.
something. So it's easier for them to exit rather than engaging in the conversation.
So you would say that's like diverting attention from the problem, or
I guess they were technically-
or avoiding the problem?
Yeah, I think I went to one of the workshop and they said the technical term for that is exit, because that's like an
Okay.
highway you're going and you get.
And you're like, I'm gonna cry myself right off this road.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any way you write it, that's fine.
Exiting out.
Yeah. I have a family. I have a mom who is so hard to reach, and I was able to engage her. The first couple of times that I met with her, the only thing she did was cry.
Yeah.
I had to actually make sure that I would say one thing she did is cry, so I had to give her tissue after tissue. And initially I learned that that's a way for her to get out of any conversation. And eventually
Yeah.
I learned my own technique.
I said, you can cry maybe a few minutes and then we have to talk.
We're going to
It's very
continue.
important. I need to
Yeah.
talk with you. And she learned, and I'm telling I swear that she stopped crying.
Yeah. Well, because she knows it's not a skill that's going to work with you. I'm sure it's something that she developed that worked really well for her in a lot of situations. But then she met you and was like,
It's sort of,
"Yeah."
it's a,
No, but she was using the DCF too, and
Yeah.
I realized that she used it in many different places.
Yeah.
Now she knew which one to use, which one
Yep.
to not. But she still
Which
used
is
it.
pretty smart. If you have to, if everybody's asking you for things and everybody is demanding of things and you break into tears and everyone's like, oh, I'm so sorry, let's just give you some time. That's actually a pretty good coping skill, except then it is really short term. It doesn't sort of change things.
but it's
long
similar
term.
to what Sarah was saying about the angry, aggressive parent, right? It's covering something up.
And also, some parents that are crying, it may not be a coping
might be
skill.
depression.
It may be depression or not feeling heard by anybody, and sort of the internal sadness around that too. Does anybody?
But we have, my experience is that there's a fair amount of our parents that have preschool anxiety.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. That that's just their response.
Exactly. And do you think that it's, not to put you on the spot so I can open this to anyone, do you think that it's that population just has a higher likelihood of developing anxiety, or do you think it's other things that have led to their anxiety?
I think that they've got more like than we have.
Yeah. And most likely, a lot of the families that we work with have trauma history themselves, which, trauma, anxiety, depression, anger, it all sort of is intertwined. Does anybody else have any?
I was just thinking it is a behavior. It's not necessarily the same as these behaviors, but I find it really challenging. It's a huge bias of mine that I've dealt with like my entire career is if I know that a parent, like if a mother was using during pregnancy, and then, I mean, this is triggered a lot in this training because if the addiction continues, then I think that on my part, it's harder for me to like remain like open-hearted.
Right.
And it takes a lot. But I think that that's something that's really key to know about a family's history in some ways.
Yep.
And then at the same time, it can be that thing that like, you know that one nugget of information, it may really help you to piece things together. And then at the same time, it can be the thing that just like, if that parent,
But the important part of what you're saying, which is great, is that you recognize that in yourself.
Right, yeah.
It becomes a problem when you don't know.
Right.
You're getting triggered and you don't know.
Right.
Then, you're not able to be reflective. So.
And that, go ahead.
I was just going to say that with all of these characteristics and behaviors, once you have the opportunity to understand the history or understand the reason for the behaviors, what a difference it makes in being
Yes.
able to engage with that family and make a difference.
And can you say the word why? It's empathy.
The empathy, right.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I'm not saying we're all triggered by these are hard people to work with, but
Yep.
I find that once I can dig a little, and understand why they act
Yep.
this way, their own history, can you imagine somebody with all of these issues, their own attachment disorder, their own poverty and DV situation as a child, a 2-year-old maybe with similar issues?
Yep.
And maybe is looking for the correct mental health support they need.
Right.
And I think about our teachers and the fact that they start out with this big bowl of empathy for this family, and that family's behavior chips away at it every single day. And how do we support them in maintaining that capacity to feel empathy? Because once that empathy is gone, the tolerance is not there, So we really need to think about how we can support them in maintaining that empathy. That's right. Right.
Right.
You're in a corner at that point.
And there's also a difference between empathy and having pity for the family or feeling really sorry for the family. Because the reality is we can't change what the parent has experienced, and feeling sorry for them that they went through this is, to me, very different than having empathy. Empathy is, I understand what you've gone through. That was really horrible, and we're going to move forward together. Versus I'm feeling sorry for you is, wow, that was really tough. good luck. So,
Does anyone else want to say anything about what triggers them?
Well, I think the families that I find most challenging are the ones that have flat affects.
mm-hmm.
Because it's hard to know if what you're saying is making any difference
Right.
at all.
Right.
And because you can't gauge by behavior or expression or anything. And then what I find often is that when you look at the children, they look like parents often.
Right. Well, yeah.
That same reflection of the really flat affects.
And it goes back to that video that we watched, I think it was last time, where the mother was really engaging with the child and then became still-faced, and how dysregulated the child became. And when you guys did the activity too, it was a little jarring to have your partner just stop engaging with you. And yeah. And at first you're curious and you're like, what's going on? And then after a while you just stop. And you know, teachers have a lot of families that they have to work with and a lot of things on a daily basis that they have to deal with. And if there's a parent who's coming in with a flat affect, you're going to sort of be curious initially, and then that curiosity sort of wanes, and that parent just continues along, and the child continues along, and it's sometimes taking a little bit of extra time to just keep pushing in, and hopefully at some point you do get more of a response. Yeah.
Teachers are definitely, you know, having to experience that feeling of feeling like the babysitter. Okay.
So these are just some of the things. There are many, many factors in working with hard to reach families. But, you know, something that we sometimes forget to think about is that this parent was at one point a child themselves, and oftentimes they have experienced trauma, and that's impacting their adult behavior. I mean, if you think about the brain development training that we did, or the attachment, or the early childhood, and the building the foundation, if the parent didn't have their foundation built in a solid way, how are they supposed to teach their child to do that? And just if they didn't get that foundation built as children, as adults, you see the impact. You see the walls falling down. You see the windows being all cracked. So it's just important to think about that when you're engaging with a family, and it sometimes helps to have a little bit more empathy, knowing this family, this parent really went through a tough time themselves as a child, and they're not, it's not that they don't love their child, it's that they may not know how to engage with that child in a healthy and an appropriate way. And that's a really great thing for teachers to be able to model. It's safe to engage with your child. It's safe to be able to hug your child or cuddle with them. And that may not be something that the parent learned as a child or a teenager. Mental health issues, sometimes these are hard to pick up. Usually our little red flags go off that there's something a little bit off with the parent, but it is an important factor in working with a family. You're not going to work with somebody who, you know, has unmedicated schizophrenia in the same way that you would work with a parent who has anxiety. And so it's important to know what's really going on with the parent so you can alter your engagement with them to best suit their needs and to make them the most responsive that they can be, or receptive, sorry. Any safety issues, domestic violence, like Allison had been talking about before, is huge. It impacts the child, it impacts the parents, and it impacts the parent's ability to engage with other people that are in their lives. You know, sometimes parents can be more suspicious of others, that they might find out that there's domestic violence going on, or yes, exactly.
That really quiet mom in one of the vignettes.
Yep.
Well,
Yeah.
and it's also a safety issue.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I think that we really can never forget that.
Mhm.
That particularly with domestic violence.
Exactly.
It's definitely.
It's a huge safety issue.
Yeah.
Safety is, because we know that many of these women are threatened
Yeah.
all the time
Yeah.
to keep quiet, or else they will be dead.
Mhm.
And we know, I think that we really need to appreciate what that means in terms of that if we're asking them to do something else, that in and of itself of
Puts them
making
at
that
risk.
decision
Yeah.
can be very stressful.
It can be very dangerous
Very dangerous.
in reality. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's also sometimes why we see the inconsistency, because
Yeah.
if we're pressuring them or they feel pressured to do
Right.
something, they may say yes, and then, not come because there's
Right.
good reasons why they don't come.
Because it seems like there's like the threshold of for some families, it seems like what they can handle at that, like it's so, what they can handle at that time in terms of their responsibility or accountability to their child's education
Right.
might be so, like, I mean, I've had a teacher saying to me, well, this parent won't sign the IEP, and I'm like thinking to myself, we know that this parent is probably involved in a domestic violence situation. I'm not surprised they're not signing the IEP.
Right.
That's the last thing on their mind.
Right.
So, but it's hard to keep that centered and be like, there's a level of accountability that does need to happen, but what do you do when it's
Right.
such a severe situation?
And what I often will think about is, because I'm all about the analogies, is sort of an emotional jar. And most of us, it gets filled with stresses, but then we do things, take care of ourselves, and it goes back down. A lot of the families that we deal with their stress level is so high because of domestic violence, poverty, whatever other issues are going on. Their jar is constantly full, and you add one more thing to that, and it just starts flowing over, and they can't function like that. And so one of the things to think about is what ways can you encourage that parent to lower the level in their jar. And it may not be possible. There are some huge macro things that we can't necessarily shift, but there are little things that make up and fill that jar also. And it's sort of trying to decrease those a little bit to allow the parent to have more capacity to be able to be available to sign the IEP. Medical issues, this is, again, something that a lot of parents don't want to share. It's, either embarrassing or it's just too detailed or they don't, whatever issue they're having around it. But it's an important thing to think about. If the parent has a medical issue which, doesn't allow them to be able to pick up the child because they can't lift more than 10 pounds, but then you're thinking, why doesn't this parent ever pick up this kid? What's wrong with that parent? And what's it doing to their relationship? It's really important information to know because it's, again, sort of judging it on face value, you make these assumptions, this is what I'm seeing, but it's important to talk with the parent and really to find out what's going on.
We got to roll a little bit SP.
So
I mean,
that
SL.
should be an assessment question then, like when we're working with particular families to kind of gently explore if there's something so that you don't always go to a place of that is an attachment problem.
Right.
Well, and
So-
it's also, I think it's hard to do it in an initial assessment because you really need to establish that relationship with the family in order to get the level of trust for them to disclose this stuff. So, and the most important thing to remember in working with hard to reach families is that the child is experiencing, whatever you're experiencing for those 5 minutes at pick up and drop off, the child is experiencing that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. For the
Except
most
that
part.
when they're with you.
Except when they're in childcare. So, but if teachers need motivation to sort of take that extra couple seconds to think about that child, when they leave and you're like, oh, thank God that parent's left because that was just such a headache for me. Now that's that child's experience for the next 12 hours or whatever it is. So why do parents act this way? We've talked a lot about these. And I think a really interesting one is the caregiver's perception, because their perception is reality. Like, we may think, oh, well, the classroom is a really safe place, but if the parent doesn't see it as a safe place, there goes that relationship. And so it's really important to find out what is the parent's perception or the caregiver's perception, because it's not always the parent. Sometimes it's the grandparent or foster parents or whoever else is involved with the child. Negative experiences with other schools, because, you know, we're all in the education field and most of us have fond feelings about school in some fashion, but that is definitely not the case for everyone, and it can be really triggering to a parent.
They think of teachers, and teachers do not know this, as authority figures.
Yes.
And so what I always say at my teacher workshops around this issue is, you know, how many of you have kids? How many of you guys got kids? How many of you guys have gone to parent-teacher conferences? Even though things are going well, do your hands still sweat?
Yep.
They do. And that's when things are going well.
Yep.
So what's it like for that parent when things aren't going so well?
So just another couple of reasons where a lot of the things that we've talked about over here is denial, resentment of invasion of privacy, or shame. You know, nobody wants to talk about shame, but it's often present with a lot of the families that we work with.
We kind of got a rule, Sarah.
So just some of the things that work. Building rapport is probably one of the most important things that you can do with a family. These families are involved with a lot of systems that don't encourage trust, and it's something that you have to work on, that you have to build with the family. You know, giving compliments, like what Amy had said before, not just making up compliments, but actually giving authentic compliments. Active listening, you know, we're all so busy, we're flying at the speed of light, but it's important to stop and actually hear what the parent is saying and respond accordingly, and then having empathy for the family's situation.
I think for your teachers too, getting across the notion for them that they're not going to love every family, and every family's not going to love them, and that's okay, but they still are both caretaking for this child. So how are they going to create an amicable environment where they can both caretake for this child?
Clear communication, being authentic. This is something, you know, that I say, but not everybody necessarily understands it, and it's important to break it out for teachers, the difference between being authentic and being the, yeah, it's so great to see you kind of thing, because parents pick up on that. They're very sensitive to those professionals that they're engaging with who really want to engage with them, and those who are just like, I need to talk to you, now we're going to move on. Being specific, maintaining boundaries, particularly in safety instances, and keeping cool. You know, it's really easy, particularly when you're dealing with a really aggressive parent. What they're looking for in response is to push you away or for you to become aggressive towards them. And as the professional in the relationship, it's important to maintain a neutral tone, to keep the level of your voice low, so that you're not playing that game with that parent. You're not engaging in that way, and you're showing them, we can get through this together, we can be calm, and we can come out on the other side and refocus on the issue at hand. And keeping a neutral stance. I've totally seen people, you know, you lean into a client who's really getting in your face. It doesn't work.
Doesn't work with kids either.
Yeah, definitely. And we've talked a little bit about this too, the reflective capacity. There are two parties in every conversation. There are sometimes more parties, but if you're talking about a teacher and a parent, or a teacher and a child, what is the teacher bringing to that situation? Because they're always bringing something. They may identify the parent as the problem and the parent's the one bringing the issue, but they also bring their whole history with them, and it's going to indicate, or it's going to dictate how they're going to respond to certain behaviors from a parent. And also, what assumptions are being made about these families. You know, we all do it. As much as I would love to say that we're all just open books and everybody's equal and everybody's fine, that's not true. We don't live in a colorblind society. We don't live in a society that doesn't make prejudgments. And you see a family and you're going to say, wow, you know, she's really overweight and this means blah, blah, blah. Or, oh, that person's darker and this means that. We all do it. And as much as we would like to say that we don't do that and we aren't going to bring it to the engagement with the parent, we do. And then also having them slow down and think about what's really going on in this conversation. This parent is in my face, but why are they in my face? It's so rarely about the emotion that's right in front of you. It's really usually the underlying stuff, and it's important to slow down in the conversation and to think about really what's really going on here. So working with DCF.
This could be a 5-hour training in and of itself.
So we're just gonna address it briefly because there's a more exciting section after this. So why do they? The number one question that I always get is why do they remove some kids and not others? What you have to think about when dealing with DCF is, for them, safety is paramount. They're constantly assessing risk. Is the risk to leave this child in the home outweigh the trauma of removing this child? And I'm not saying every case is perfect. They don't always make the right decision according to us, but ultimately the responsibility does lay with them. Is something damaging going to happen to this child if they are left in the home? And that's ultimately what they need to look about that in terms of whether they're going to remove a child or leave a child in the home.
When we're dealing with hygiene issues and we're so concerned, DCF is measuring lethality.
Right.
You know.
Well, the other thing is not necessarily DCF. We always tend to blame them, but our court system doesn't help at all.
That's an excellent point.
Yep.
When I have been in courts for different children, and they have to have the amount of papers, and it doesn't matter because a parent's rights doesn't get terminated just because somebody says that they something right. So it's very hard to prove to some of these judges whether they are okay to remove this child or not.
Exactly.
And that's the biggest kind of.
Yeah.
And they are, in a lot of ways, the judges are in like a whole nother world. Like for them, it's not, it is about the kids, but it's not really. It's about case law and what's the history of this case law, and can we terminate this parents' rights because this other judge was overturned and we don't want to be overturned, and it's all about reputation, and unfortunately the kids get lost in that a lot of the time. And the good news is every child who's involved with the court system does have an attorney appointed to them, which is good. Sometimes a mixed bag on whether they're a good attorney or not, and also with the 0 to 3 population, sometimes attorneys are less responsive because they don't know what to be looking for. So, but that's like a whole nother, again, a 5-hour training. So what's the best way to communicate? Email, phone, letter, it varies worker by worker.
All of these.
Yes. When in doubt, do all 3. I've had workers that tell me they don't pick up their voicemails because they just don't have the time, but if I catch them on email, they will respond immediately. And then I get the workers who just don't have the time to do email or phone, and so I send them a letter.
As I've been told, I'm so sorry you didn't make the list today.
Yeah, exactly. And they've got, hundreds of calls, and DCF's expectation is that the workers will be out in the field 80% of the time, seeing kids or going to meetings or doing whatever they're doing. And so that leaves 20% of their time to be answering all the emails and all the phone calls and doing all their casework when they're actually in the office. And it's not to make excuses, because there are some workers who are really good and return all their phone calls and return all their emails. And then there's some workers who don't at all. But for the most part, they fall into sort of the middle of the spectrum, and they're trying, but it's a lot for them to be doing.
I want to go back and revisit our DCF kids and our work with families, the kids who have open cases, who are getting transportation. I have a very big concern that I want you guys to be thinking about, because we're going to be creating a best practice guide, recommendations to the state, about the fact that our teachers don't get to develop relationships with those families. And that's a real glitch in our system. The transportation piece is great, but our teachers don't develop relationships. I mean, PCDC is so lucky to have family advocates, but our teachers are the ones that are doing the direct care with these children, and they aren't getting an opportunity to develop relationships with the families. So I just would like you guys to think about that. I want to get creative about making recommendations around that. And one of the pieces, I know that our teachers are already overworked, but is the possibility of teachers doing home visiting as well.
Ours do. At our agency,
Yours
they do
do.
home visits, and they have sometimes parents' monthly family meetings.
They do.
So parents come, caregivers.
Because I've heard feedback, and I won't name any names, but I've heard feedback from some of your teachers that they don't know these families. So,
well, they have 2 visits a year that we have to do. Not always you catch these parents. So, as you see, we have a lot to deal with them as well. So, we should be doing them, and teachers are provided with times to be able to do that. However, getting to the parent to agree upon either coming to the site or open their home to us to go there, it's a totally different.
And it's not a criticism of your teachers at all. It's that lack of pickup and drop off.
Exactly.
You know, that lack of a daily exchange that just doesn't occur.
But even like that, sometimes, I mean, I thought about that because right now with the QRIS, their biggest thing is infants. They're supposed to have, in order to get to that next level, you're supposed to have that daily contact with the parents. So if an infant's in the bus, that means that technically you're not having that.
Right.
And we worked it around because we do have a monitor that goes on the bus, and so they're hired by us, so they have that communication and bring that communication back and forth. But if the parent doesn't have the transportation, then the child won't be in care. So it's a dilemma because if we get rid of the transportation, now you get rid of all these parents that has no way of getting this child in that care.
Right.
Exactly.
And then, so
Oh yeah, it's
either
totally.
way,
I know the transportation's essential. It's a bind. It's a double bind. But the other piece to that is teachers not having access to what DCF has for history. That's huge. So those are just 2 pieces I'd like to put out there, and I'd like some feedback from you guys about. So.
And just very quickly, why is it difficult sometimes to maintain regular communication with DCF? I do think there's a component of what Allison had talked about. You know, DCF is also not able to necessarily establish those relationships with the teachers who are the direct line about what's happening with the child on a day-to-day basis. They're often talking with the family advocates or the site supervisors or the social workers at the child care center. And, you know, workers who are busy, it's important for them to feel invested and want to have that communication, but if they don't have the relationship, then they're not going to feel invested. And also, just very quickly, a lot of DCF workers have what Allison is going to talk about in a second, which is vicarious trauma. And when you have vicarious trauma, your level of energy around engagement tends to be much lower. Because your emotional jar is so filled with everybody else's trauma that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, you just can't add anything else to that, and so you just can't return those phone calls. You just can't email people back because it means there's going to be 8 steps that you're going to have to do after that. Because with DCF, and I worked for DCF in California for 4 years, everybody always needs something. And when you're getting phone calls or emails, it's always somebody's asking you for something. And if your jar is so full anyways around all the trauma that you know these kids and these families have experienced, it's really hard to garner the energy to be able to return those calls and to do the communication that's really necessary for the cases.
And they don't have a holding environment around them that's helping them through that.
Yeah. Okay.
So let's talk about vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. So care providers are unique people. We have a gift of being able to connect to others in ways that are difficult to explain and even more difficult for others to understand. Our unique ability to emotionally join with our early education and care kids and families that allows us a near first-hand experience of their inner world is perhaps our greatest gift. It is also our greatest challenge. Right? So us being care providers, you know, we are a unique breed of people. And we tend to take on the world. And not always, but quite often, one of 2 things can happen. You can experience vicarious traumatization, or you can experience compassion fatigue. And it's important to distinguish between the 2. You know, vicarious traumatization is when you experience a profound shift in your worldview due to working with people who have experienced trauma. And compassion fatigue is the inability to react sympathetically to a crisis, disaster, etc., because of overexposure to previous crisis, disasters, exposure. So with vicarious traumatization, you're activated by the experience. And with compassion fatigue, you're dulled by the experience. Does that make sense? So guess what we're going to do? We're going to do a compassion fatigue checklist. Why don't you guys go ahead and fill it out, and we'll do the scoring later, okay? PowerPoint. So, like we were saying before, burnout versus vicarious trauma is really the way to look at it. And I want you guys to be thinking about your teachers, because oftentimes, I'll just realize that I haven't considered where they're at in their level of compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma. When I'm doing my observations and recommendations, and it's really important to keep that in mind. Yep. So, Catherine Burns says that vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue shatter assumptions about basic beliefs in our world for safety, security, trust, and justice. Repeated exposure to the cruelty of others to innocent victims, heightened awareness of vulnerability and fragility of life, powerlessness of victim transferred to professional, and sense of alienation develops. So why us? Vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue happen because you care about people who have been hurt. And that's where you start. And, and we think about this, your system and your trickling all the way down to your teachers, all of us are the types of people that care about people. And when we think about DCF and their system, all of us are people who care about people. And our DCF workers get so overloaded by what they see in everyday life that sometimes they can appear callous or unfeeling. So it's just important to keep that in mind when we're doing our outreach to them too. Does it happen forever? No, it doesn't have to happen forever. But there might come a time with your teachers or with yourselves where you really need to think about reaching out for support services. Right? Signs of it in your life: no time or energy for yourself, difficulty managing your emotions, difficulty accepting or feeling okay about yourself, problems managing the boundaries between yourself and others, disconnection from loved ones, physical problems, difficulty feeling connected to what's going on around you or within you, loss of meaning and hope, and resentment of coworkers.
And if you think about the sort of emotional jar that I was talking about before, when you're experiencing vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue, your jar is filled all the time. So it really doesn't allow you any emotional space to be able to, be in a healthy relationship with your partner or have the energy to spend with your own kids on the weekends, things like that.
And I think, in all honesty, with the work that we do, that to some level or another, we have this experience. And some of us are better caretakers for ourselves than others, and we know how to balance that. Or we're having a specific event happening that is impacting us more deeply because it triggers something in us that makes us feel, more deeply about it. Or less deeply. We get triggered and we feel numb. And I can't really relate to that family. Sorry, but I don't feel bad for you. I don't feel empathy for you, So I think it's really important to check in with yourself, because I don't think it's like, oh, I'm doing fine. Now I have compassion fatigue. I think it's this, and that we all have to check in with ourselves in the work that we do. So some of the symptoms and signs of physical and psychological: hyperarousal, repeated thought or images, feeling numb, feeling unable to tolerate strong emotions, increased sensitivity to violence, cynicism, general despair and hopelessness, guilt regarding your own survival, anger, disgust, and fear. And again, I think that given any given day, depending on our caseload or our, who we're dealing with and how we're having to interact and put all the pieces together for everybody, that we can all have these experiences. So.
And this is also people that experience trauma in general, like direct trauma, also feel these.
Yeah.
So that's the vicarious trauma. You're basically experiencing what people have experienced, but in a vicarious way.
Yeah. So some of the self-care strategies sound very simple, but do we really do them? Escape, get away from it all. I'm doing that next week, actually. Rest, play, and find help. Wow, we wrapped up early. So for discussion, how does children's trauma impact you on a daily basis? Oh, before we go into that, we want to score our compassion fatigue checklist.
So on the back page of the checklist, there's the way to score. We're just going to do the compassion and satisfaction scale. If at a later point you want to scale your burnout and or secondary trauma stress, you can totally do that also. It covers all three. But it basically, you look at answers 3, 6, 12, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 27, and 30, and write down what number you wrote, and then total it. And then it'll tell you next to that, it'll tell you sort of where your compassion satisfaction is.
So this is showing you the good news, correct, Sarah? It's like,
yes, it's a glass half empty, glass half full kind of thing.
It's measuring satisfaction, not
right.
fatigue. But, yeah.
But if you have low compassion satisfaction, chances are you're higher compassion fatigue. And just for giggles, why don't we also do the secondary trauma stress scale? It's just filling in the numbers for another set of questions. Secondary traumatic stress is similar to vicarious trauma, where basically you're experiencing the trauma through other people. So I'm not going to ask anybody's number, but was anybody surprised at how they scored themselves on either the compassion satisfaction or the secondary traumatic stress? Or are you falling sort of where you think you are? Sort of where you think you are? That's good. That's good. That means that you are in tune with yourself and you know sort of what you need to strengthen and where you're doing okay. So.
Can you see this being useful for your teachers? Bless you. All right, so does anyone want to respond to how do children's trauma impact you on a daily basis?
It does definitely impact me on a daily basis, and I also on a daily basis have to stay equally in touch with how I am keeping my stress level down and sort of, replenishing. So I'm equally aware of it on both sides,
Yeah.
but it definitely does impact me.
Yeah.
I would have to, because of my role as a consultant, I don't feel like I get as close in this role, but in a previous role, working as a teacher in a room for, a pediatric unit, children who are all like wards of the state and all, shaken baby syndrome, et cetera, and there I found hyper protective kind of things coming out of me and very blurry boundaries. In my own, I wouldn't let it necessarily flow out, but inside me, I was like, these are my kids. Yep. Like, it was so unbelievably hard. Yeah. It's just knowing what they had been through, and when you know a child literally been left by the side of the road in a wheelchair, it's like, how does it not get inside you? Like, how does that not just?
And I think with that, it's sort of looking at your own empathy and sadness and protectiveness for that child versus having it turn into anger, because the anger is usually just covering something else, the sort of pain and the hurt that child experienced. And that is a way, that vicarious trauma also happens, is empathizing so much with that child that you're basically re-experiencing that over and over in your head, like, what was it like for that kid, or what happened, or what if, and it's these cycles that you get into that are really hard to stop once you start them. And that's sort of where, meditation, yoga, relaxation things, calming yourself and calming all the thoughts, because we work with a lot of very traumatized kids, and we've talked a lot about needing to know their history. But the flip side of that is once you know their history, it's really hard to keep that out of your head and not think about that when you're trying to relax and go to sleep at night, when you're thinking about, wow, that kid was burned by a curling iron by the mom, or and what was that experience like for them.
It's that continuum that we discussed of either feeling it too much, getting flooded by it, and letting it mess your boundaries up, you know, or just getting to a point where you can't feel it anymore, or else, you know, yeah.
For me, to use trauma, like, you know, when I know these stories, actually I go back home and try to look in a different lens. So I feel like since I've started this work, I looked in a very different lens about how, I mean, me as a parent get better, because I know what other kids are going through, and I didn't want them to be in that condition.
Right.
So in some ways, it taught me a lesson as a person. But I know that it's definitely like when a parent does something like that, so you shake your head, and then you know that you only can do so much.
Right. Yeah.
So you get to learn from this job that your hands are tied some ways. You can't really go in their body and try to dissect everything, so you can do so much, and then you draw their boundary and say, you know, it's up to them to make a decision. So it really teaches you a boundary starting from this job.
Yeah.
And I think you're also right that in a lot of ways it can be helpful for us, you know, either as parents or in relationships, knowing how bad it can be and wanting to make that extra effort to make it better in the relationships that you can control. But it's also important to have the emotional energy in order to do that, because if you're exposed to trauma all the time, then when you come home, what are you doing with that trauma? Because most partners or friends, family don't really want to hear about all these horrible things that are happening to the kids. So where does it go? You push it down inside you, but you can only push it down for so long before it starts coming back out in a variety of different ways.
Or you talk to your partner and they pretend they're listening.
I love to drive. Driving is great, and that's great to find different things that work for each person. Like, I worked with a woman who was like, when I get stressed from all the processing of all the trauma, she doesn't want to be near a car. She just wants to be in a quiet, safe place. For me, I'm like, stick me in a car and let me just drive. And that's just something that works for me. And it's sort of thinking about what works for you in sort of not washing yourself of the trauma, but processing it through. Like, the kids can't usually process it. It's sort of internal within them, and they need to do that within the relationship. But as adults, it's important for us to process through. You hold the trauma, and then you can either give it back if it's a functional adult, or you need to put it to the side so that it's not then weighting you down all the time.
But I think the piece that you had mentioned in that list about people feeling like almost guilty about being happy.
Yes.
I think that's a big piece, because I've seen it with myself, and I've seen it with a lot of professionals I've worked with. I mean, working in human services education, I've run into a lot of very caring people, and it's like, people just, it's almost like, well, I shouldn't take time for myself. I shouldn't be happy because this child's gone through this. How could I possibly? And I think it's very real.
Yeah.
I totally think so. And I think it's important to try to balance your life too. So, you know, when I was in graduate school and I was hearing about all these traumatic cases, and I intentionally went out to find a very healthy, functional family that I could babysit for, and they were like, do you want to do this every Saturday? And I was like, yes, please. Because it was just nice to be with a child who I didn't have to worry about, that I knew was going to be okay. And it did balance the picture a little bit, that not every child is traumatized, not every child is involved with DCF. It's actually a very small population, but we see it. It's like 95% of the kids that we work with. And so it's important to make sure that you're balancing it so that it's not, that doesn't become your worldview. Every child in the world is traumatized, and it's my responsibility to hold that and protect that child.
Does anyone else want to speak to this?
Question about, are you familiar with the ACT program, the ACT program? It stands for Adults and Children Together, and it's developed by the American Psychological Association and NAUIC, and it's an 8-week program for parents, and it can be for children too. 8 training sessions or discussion sessions, whatever, on violence prevention and conflict resolution. And teaching staff and administrators and whatever can participate in a train the trainers. Couple days of training. Brandeis University is kind of the hub for it in this area, and I can forward information to you.
That would be awesome.
Great.
ACT
Yeah.
Yeah.
You found the
So
training to be
I've
very
done-
useful?
I've done the training, but I haven't implemented it
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
yet. I felt like for my school in our population, I felt like we probably couldn't get people to commit to 8 weeks.
Yeah, 8 weeks
It's-
is tough.
It's really great with teen parents. Sometimes they do it out of a high school. But, different populations, it's better suited for. So I'm trying to kind of rework it to maybe a
Right,
two-session
right.
thing.
Well, forward it to us. I'd be curious to see it. Thank you. Anybody else about how trauma impacts your daily life? Okay. What about thoughts and questions about all 4 seasons? Have you guys got any feedback?
All 4 sessions.
It feels like 4 seasons. I missed 2 of them. Sessions. Anything you guys want to share with us that you're not going to share on your evals or thoughts about it? Thank you. Thank you so much for coming and committing.